planet have restricted access to imagery because of the trouble in the Middle East to international customers as a response to demand from the American government. As a response to that and previous concerns, you now find many countries around the world deploying their own capability to launch and process satellite imagery. And that really is front and center a sovereign capability that nations are now much more concerned of.
So many complex layers to it. And I think you would have to break it down into its individual components to get agreement on storage in and of itself. Huge issue and undertaking. Accessibility, permissions, sharing, processing. These are all things that are opening up a can of worms, which I think we need to do.
WGIC Horizons, a podcast for latest technology, business, partnerships, and policy trends in geospatial industry.
Welcome to Horizons, a WGIC podcast. I'm Kathy Martin, General Manager of Managed Business Solutions and a WGIC board member. I'm joined today by Ed Parsons, Digital Geography, and Shannon Brlansky, GISP and Geospatial Services Team Lead at MBS. So the main topic of our podcast today is data sovereignty. So in a previous podcast, John Renard set the stage for this discussion by covering the growing importance and implications of data sovereignty. And today we're going to continue that discussion with Ed and Shannon to dive deeper into the topic. So please welcome Ed and Shannon. Please give us a little bit of some background on you. And, your backgrounds and professional experience are very impressive. So I want to give you a few moments to introduce yourself. So Ed?
Thank you for the invitation. It's wonderful to be able to participate. I guess, my background is long, but maybe not that illustrious. I started out as an academic, set up the first undergraduate degree in GIS here in Europe in the late 80s, early 1990s. Then worked for a software company you probably heard of, Autodesk, involved in rolling out WGIS. Then worked for Ordnance Survey, National Mapping Agency here in the UK, and was the Chief Technology Officer there, running the internal systems to deliver the databases that are used to capture the mapping data in the UK. It's much more detailed than, say, in the US because the country is much smaller, but it's a complex system, as you might imagine. And for then almost the last 20 years, I've been working for Google. I was Google's geospatial technologist. I stopped working for Google a year or so ago, and I'm now a fractional executive, I think they call me these days, which means I do odd little pieces of work here and there, independent consultancy, and enjoying partial retirement after a long time making maps.
Yes, that's quite a career there, especially in the heyday of GIS in the 80s and 90s.
All right. Yeah, I'm Shannon Brlansky, and as Kathy mentioned, I'm the Geospatial Services Team Lead at MBS. So in my role right now, I oversee our GIS team, provide technical leadership and guidance, and also help shape project strategy, business development efforts, and client partnerships. In addition to that, I also support our contracts with the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and I've done that for nearly 9 years now. So I started with the Division of Land Titles and Records, where I worked on essentially mapping legal land descriptions and reservation boundaries. But about 7 years ago, I transitioned to the Safety of Dams branch under the Division of Water and Power. So today my work mainly focuses on managing our enterprise GIS system, automating workflows with Python, maintaining our national dam inventory data set, and also supporting flood inundation mapping. So throughout both roles, data governance has been an important part of my work. So looking forward to discussing why it's becoming increasingly important across the geospatial industry.
Do you want to give a quick definition of data residency and data sovereignty? I think just to set the stage of what we're going to be talking about here. And then Ed, I'll ask you what your definitions are and what it means for you.
Yeah, absolutely. So definitely two terms that are often used together, but mean different things. So data residency is really about where the data is physically stored. So it might just be sensitive data sets need to remain on servers located in the US or another specific geographic region. While data sovereignty is really about who has the legal authority to govern that data. So it's really the laws, regulation, and governance frameworks to determine how the data can be collected, stored, accessed, processed, and shared. So like real basic data residency is where the data lives. Data sovereignty tells us who makes the rules.
Yeah, with your background, Ed, it'd be interesting to kind of get your take on what that is. And then also, starting with GIS out in the 1980s, I started in the late 90s, and I'm sure that a lot has changed even in between that span of time. But, what are your thoughts on what does this mean to you? And how has it changed and evolved since you first got started?
It's really interesting. I mean, I think Shannon's definitions were perfect, and I think it's a really good starting point because this has changed, and it continually changes over time, and I think it changes over as our sophistication and our use of geographic data changes over time as well. In that early period in the 1980s and 90s, it was really a moot point. The difference between sovereignty and residency didn't really mean very much because we didn't have the data that we needed. And, for the first part of our history, let's say there was a deficit of information, there was a deficit of data, and we spent a lot of time and effort capturing whatever data that we could. It tended to be data that you captured for your own internal purposes to meet your own needs, be that in local, municipal, federal government, or in the commercial sector. We then went through, I think, probably a decade or two where there was an abundance of data that was captured by large corporations, Google, but also, Esri and the specialist providers, the likes of Navtac and TeleAtlas in their days, collected these data sets, did so pretty much on an international basis. And there wasn't a particular concern around sovereignty or particular concern around where the data sat, where it was resident, because it was largely accessible to people. It wasn't a problem. And I think now we've shifted again. And in the last probably 5 years or so, the last half decade, the focus has shifted once again. And now sovereignty is a much bigger issue because the open networks that we previously relied on are no longer necessarily there. Business models change, geopolitics changes, and we're back now focused on, well, what does sovereignty mean? What happens when we no longer get access to the data that we assumed we would have access to? Or actually, as has always been the case, there are parts of the world where, for various reasons, we could never get access to data. I've got many examples where supposedly, Google mapping the world in great detail, we were frustrated and there were parts of the world where we couldn't capture data.
I remember that from doing aerial acquisition as well. Like there are certain parts of the world we could not access. And also on top of that, the use of data is so important for things that we all have to deal with, right? Climate resiliency. And so where does that balance fit between, okay, I need this as a city government or a state government or a national organization, need this data to be able to solve a wildfire risk, which is something we deal with a lot here in Colorado and in the Western United States. But, how do you see those challenges addressed with data sovereignty and data residency? How do you feel that is impacted? Just the access to data for those types of scenarios.
I think access. I think is a helpful term here because it's not just the case that the data might exist somewhere. If it's inaccessible, that's meaningless. What we talk about much more these days, I think, is about how accessible is this data. It exists, it's maintained, and I know where to go to get access to it, and I know the processes by which I can get access to it. That's kind of the ideal circumstances, and I think it's kind of hard to separate out, data in itself from access to that data. So we need to look at the two together. In many ways, the current discussions around sovereignty just require us now to focus on what does that really mean? What does it mean to be accessible? Is it accessible to everybody in the same way? Or are there different access rights depending on the use? Are the geographical restrictions on access to data? These are the things that are becoming now much more to the fore. But it is about that that access term, and I think it's forcing us to be much more explicit in terms of what does that mean? Do we need to build in place mechanisms that we can actually quantify access and codify it, not necessarily purely contractually, but have a joint understanding of what I'm making this data accessible to you means?
Yeah, I agree with that. And it's always such a challenge, especially when you have private enterprise collecting the data. And then where does it go and how does it get to where other organizations can access it?
Yeah, I'd like to add collaboration with that too. Collaboration. I mean, for our dam safety program, when we were dealing with tribal nations, jurisdiction becomes very important. And even on the national and, federal, state, local level. So the accessibility, but also knowing how to communicate and collaborate with all parties involved for all stakeholders is really crucial for, when we're talking about life safety.
Yeah. And data type matters, right? Base maps, contains very generalized data, and parcel level data might include some ownership information or critical infrastructure information. So, in your experience, and maybe Shannon too, in these cases, how should we approach these different data types? I mean, is there that line where we can draw and say, okay, these layers should be publicly available, and then these other layers should not, even though you may need those other layers? What are your thoughts on that and some of the scenarios you might have run into?
Shannon, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I can go first. I mean, I've dealt with legal land description, parcel information. I mean, yeah, you have to take the security, seriously. And it's really about protecting people, protecting their sensitive information that is at the forefront. It's kind of an interesting concept, I think, for the U.S. with data sovereignty. We don't really talk about data sovereignty as a whole. We talk about it as like the pieces of it, right? Where's data stored? How can you access it? Permissions, security. And I think it would be more beneficial to have a holistic approach to it, to look at it that way. I think we just need to be cognizant, and I think we also different sectors have different standards, which makes it very difficult. You have healthcare, utilities, land ownership. These are all kind of segmented from each other, which isn't maybe the best way to go about it, but it's just how I think things have evolved in the US, which makes it a little difficult to have a holistic framework of this. So I think you do your best to protect the information, try and, collaborate, have trust with your partners, but it's a difficult problem.
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely right. And I think it's become certainly more complicated. I think there was a mindset, a zeitgeist, if you like, the way that the industry was thinking, say, in the early 2000s, with a big focus around open data, particularly in Europe. And that had come largely from looking across the pond to the United States to say, well, this is really good. All of these funded data sets, either funded by local government or federal government, and that data by default is made openly accessible to people. And, look how much exploitation of that data is going on. We should do more of that. So there was a big focus in Europe towards open data. And that lasted for maybe a decade. And then people decided, well, actually, maybe this isn't necessarily what we wanted to do, because we weren't actually funding the capture and the maintenance of the data in a way that was really sustainable. And then there were concerns, as you pointed out, Shannon, about critical infrastructure. And should we really be making available open data sets of where electric transformer stations are, or water utilities, or other information that has a security concern related to it? So there's been a bit of a pushback, and now there really needs to be that kind of understanding of, what's the data value in any particular use case. And where once upon a time the suggested default position was data should be open and accessible, that's not the case anymore. And that's understandable. The world today geopolitically is much more complicated, and so it's understandable that people are trying to find where is the center ground now between making informationally accessible because it's good for society, but on the same hand, looking at, well, there's clearly defense and security concerns around some data sets from a national security point of view. And there's also, the focus, I guess, probably still much more felt here in Europe around privacy and, GDPR and access to information that may be perceived to be personal. And that's quite a broad definition, much broader than you might imagine. And that clearly then also complicates data access.
I think we're becoming more and more, concerned with that type of personal information here in the United States as well. And as Shannon mentioned earlier, I mean, we don't really talk too much about data sovereignty here in the U.S. It's mostly in Europe that this comes up quite a bit. And what do you think the main challenge is? I mean, we've talked a little bit about this, but U.S. versus Europe, and I think maybe some of it comes down to
Absolutely.
mindset of what data should be shared, and but
Yeah.
what are your thoughts on that?
There certainly is a big difference. One of my first jobs at Google was helping roll out Street View. So the high resolution terrestrial photographs. When it was initially introduced as a concept, it was rolled out in North America. There were no specific privacy concerns. We rolled it out. It was great, very well received. Then when Google tried to do the same thing in Europe, it suddenly discovered actually that there were concerns expressed in Europe for privacy of making available images of people going about their day-to-day lives or car registration plates. And it was one of the first times that at Google we started to deploy AI to actually automatically recognize people's faces and registration plates so we could blur them. And I remember spending quite a lot of time talking to my colleagues in California saying, well, look, in Europe, you have to remember that within living memory, there were things like the Stasi, where people at a whole country scale were being spied upon by their governments. So the trust is very different. It's a very different culture. And also, I guess there is, not to put too fine a point on it, a view held in Europe that much of the data that is part of our day-to-day lives are held by large American companies. Big tech is a really important term in Europe, and it comes from a position of fundamental distrust. European citizens are not happy having their data held by American corporates held in data centers somewhere in the middle of Texas where they have little understanding or access to.
Yeah, I agree. I think that the cloud storage and the cloud technology, US based cloud storage and technology is could be a factor in that. And I've heard that, come up in the past. So that's spot on there. I think for the US, and Shannon, you can weigh in on this as well. I think our big wake up call here in the US for critical infrastructure was 9/11. And, then we started locking down some of the data sets that we had that used to be publicly available to protect critical infrastructure. So it's a different way that we have approached it, and more recently, than I think that they have experienced in
I would
Europe.
completely agree. I think, again, we focus more on terms of like national security, cybersecurity, data storage, rather than data sovereignty. I think that's how we focus more on those terminology, but we're kind of we're talking about the same thing with it.
And I think that kind of point about access is also useful because with the growth of AI and AI systems, it's now quite hard to separate out the data and the application that's making use of that data. It's relatively trivial now using vibe computing to build what would have taken perhaps 6 months to develop a WebGIS system only a few years ago. You can now do that in a day, but the connection between the data and the application that processes that data, that does the analysis, that's pretty much disappeared now. You don't see those two things as being disconnected. And it also means that then when that access technology is removed, you then remove access to the data by default. And there has been, a recent case, particularly visible here in Europe, where some of Anthropic's latest AI tools were prevented from export, which meant users in Europe couldn't have access to those tools anymore. And if they were using those tools to access data, well, they couldn't get access to that data anymore.
Right, right. Yeah, that is a concern. You can see how that goes. And as you know, also could be impacted by geopolitical situations that are happening, between the US
Exactly.
and other
And you
countries
see
and
a lot
vice
of that now
versa.
in a particular area I guess have focused on in the past couple of years is in Earth observation, where, for a long time, everyone was quite happy to accept the fact that we could acquire imagery either at a governmental level or at a commercial level from, American providers of high resolution, low Earth orbit satellite imagery. There's now a lot of doubt around that. And again, Planet have restricted access to imagery because of the trouble in the Middle East to international customers as a response to demand from the American government. As a response to that and previous concerns, you now find many countries around the world deploying their own capability to launch and process satellite imagery. And that really is front and center a sovereign capability that nations are now much more concerned of. Can we necessarily rely on the people that we used to rely on to give us access to information? Maybe we need to make sure that we have complete control over that whole that whole chain of data creation and manipulation ourselves. And a country like Sweden has developed their own capability now, buying satellites pretty much off the shelf, and that's an amazing change in technology.
And that's a big investment, I think, and then there has to be a roadmap for others to do the same. This is something that has evolved since I think your involvement in GIS to begin with and mine back in 1998, and the things we're talking about there are very different. It's not something I think you can switch on and off overnight, right? So I think there could be a roadmap of how does, a nation become, able to control those types of things.
And I think maybe there's an element that we've been perhaps convinced that this has all been much easier than it was. It seemed so easy and trivial to fire up Apple Maps or Google Maps and get a map of wherever you want in the world, and it and a lot of the complexity was hidden behind the scenes. You didn't have to worry about it. And part of the the big story of the last 20 years has been about making geography more accessible to people, which is a great story. But it hid the complexity that was always there and remains there. For an example from Google, we could never have maps of South Korea on our cloud infrastructure because until very recently the South Korean government forbade export of any mapping data from the country. So you had to have in Google Maps very specific servers for just South Korea in their own data format that restricted functionality because it was held differently. But that was largely, invisible to the end user, but organizations had to cope with that complexity. And you'll find, in any particular country around the world, if you look at the satellite view, which we mostly know is aerial photography in Google Maps or Apple Maps, you'll find often military institutions are blurred or have been removed from the imagery, not by the system provider, but by the organization providing data in that particular country. And to be licensed to provide data in that particular country, you have to go along with whether security measures or censorship is in place. To the end user, you didn't necessarily notice that was happening, but it's always been there. It's always been happening.
Yeah, that brings me to think, do you see a formal international standard where we agree on this and the way to approach this in the future? Do you think that, with these conversations that we're having today and some of the ones that we've had on the WGIC data committee, are we heading towards that?
My personal opinion is probably not. I think it's just too complicated. The geopolitics of any sort of international agreement at the moment, I think it will be a tall ask. Even, perhaps you just identifying the international organization that might do this work. United Nations did the open space treaty in the late 1950s, early 1960s. You can't see that being replicated now around data. So personally, I don't see it. What about you, Shannon?
I would agree with that. Honestly, when we talk about this podcast and data sovereignty, it's overwhelming. Like there's so many parts of it that it's like, wow, you can talk about so much. There's so many complex layers to it. And I think you would have to break it down into its individual components to get agreement on storage in and of itself. Huge, huge issue and undertaking. Accessibility, permissions, sharing, processing. These are all things that are opening up a can of worms, which I think we need to do. You need to go there, but it's such an overwhelming, complex problem. I thought this conversation could go so many different ways just because of how large it is. So I completely agree with you. I hope we start, I do think we need more standards with it, especially with AI now. We need it. I think the landscape is rapidly transforming. It's a little scary how much, power people can have now with AI. So it's needed, but what an undertaking.
Yeah, I mean, and I think, on the positive side, I think we have the organizations and the processes to do that standardization. So, one of the hats I currently wear is the chair of the Open Geospatial Consortium. That is a environment where you can have these conversations and yes, absolutely express the complexity that Shannon hinted at. It is really complicated, but it is at least a place where you can come and discuss these things and talk about it. I think the bigger problem is, the will to do this. And I think everyone is now, for understandable reasons, much more focused on, well, what does it mean for me in Belgium or in the Netherlands or in Canada or in a particular, even a particular county in a state in the US. We've naturally started focusing in much more narrowly at this point in time, and that makes it more difficult to do these things. But the need will reemerge because still at a fundamental level, information data is behind everything that we do. There is no AI without the data that trains the systems.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I idealistically would like to see a standard that we could all agree on, but I agree with both of you that it is a monumental effort to get there and very, very complicated. It would be, someone could spend their entire life trying to figure this out, I think. So kind of to conclude this, what role can geospatial professionals play and how could we get involved? I mean, Shannon and I are both involved in WGIC Data Committee. We're having some of these conversations, starting to write white papers, things like that. But, are there ways that other folks could get involved in this effort or become part of the conversation? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, I think, part of the problem is the language that we use. We talk about geospatial, we talk about geodata sets, and that's fine for our community, and that works. We all know what we're talking about. But the rest of the world, everybody else, still sees this fundamentally as geography and maps. And I think, despite the limitations in that we might recognize as professionals, maybe we should just change our language and talk much more about geographical problems. One of the most powerful images I think we all have seen over the past few months, is that animated map of the Straits of Hormuz that showed, okay, here are all the ships moving a year ago, and here's how few ships are moving now. That's fundamentally a geographical problem. It's a geographical problem of geopolitics. It's where the physical geography of oil distribution is, everything else. It's illustrated very, very well in an animated map that everyone can understand and interpret. So For me, I think it's much more about focusing in on just the power of geography. Everything that, most of the world's kind of major decisions that are being made, whether they're about politics or climate change or sustainability, they're all fundamentally geographical problems. They're very often communicated best using a map. Maybe we should just stick to, hey, we're geographers, make sure you involve a geographer in this process, and hey, look at this map because it really explains the story.
I agree with that. Shannon, your final thoughts on this?
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, I think like geospatial professionals were exposed to so many different sectors, and as soon as you add like location data to some of these sectors, you have like inherent risks, and I think we're all kind of exposed to like systems data architecture kind of early in our career, and we start seeing these problems right away. So I think we just need to get involved as much as possible. I mean, we do have these organizations. I think there's somehow we can get more involvement. I think we've kind of seen a drop off in participation just from young GIS professionals, and I think that is the future, is getting more people involved in how can we collaborate more on regulations. I mean, I think we all get together at conferences and we're, love the new technology that's coming out, but we don't ever talk about the regulations or how we should be moving forward with that. And so what does that look like? How can we get more consensus on that moving forward? So I don't know the solution to that, but I would love to see some more options to getting GIS professionals together to have these conversations.
Yeah, I would agree with you there. Well, thank you both for your time. I really appreciate the conversation and hope we could have some additional conversations going forward. But Ed, I really appreciate your participation in the podcast, and Shannon, your insights on some of the data that you're dealing with, US based here. And thank you both for your time today.
Thank you so much.
Like, subscribe, and share to help us spread insightful geospatial conversations.